Alright, so in this video we are going to pick up where we left off from our last screencast. So we start implementing this following and unfollowing other user feature, and let's take a look at our user model file. So let's go to app model user. So we're gonna have some relationship between two users. So one user is gonna follow other user. We're going to call them follower and following. So we're going to have many-to-many relationships. So let's create a model for that. So let's create Rails generate model relationship. And this relationship model has follower ID, which is an integer, and following followed ID, and we're gonna specify as an integer. Let's run that, and then let's open that file, db migrate. So we're gonna set null to false, null false. We're going to be accessing this quite often. We're going to add index to these IDs, follower ID, let's add index to followed ID, and lastly we're going to add index to both followed ID and follower ID, and we'll provide unique to true. So let's run rake db migrate. Alright, so now that we have relationship tables in our database, we're going to add association between these two models. So let's open up app models relationship.rb and app models user.rb. Alright, so let's start implementing follower association. So we'll say user has many, and because we're gonna have two relationships, so we can't have two has many relationships like so. So we're gonna call it passive relationship, and we have to tell the active record which class we're gonna be using. So we say class name and string relationship, and also, okay, let's open up the Rails console in our terminal, and then before we do that, let's do the other side of the association. Belongs to follower and belongs to followed, and we have to provide a class name here as well, because active record has no way of knowing which table to use. Alright, so let's open up Rails console, and let's fetch the first user from our database. Alright, so now if you run user passive relationship, it's going to throw an error which says column relationship user.id does not exist. So it's using this model's name for the foreign key, but because we don't have user ID in our relationship table, we have to provide that to our active record has many macro function. So let's call foreign key, and this is going to be followed ID, and let's provide dependent destroy, so that when we destroy our user, the relationship gets destroyed in our database as well. So let's reload that in our console, get the first user, and then call passive relationships. All right, so it's constructing this SQL statement. If you take a look at this SQL, it says select relationship from relationship table where user followed ID is the current user. So let's add has many through, has many followers, and through this passive relationships. And one more thing, we have to provide source, because by default this is going to look for, okay, let's run this in our terminal. Let's reload that and then get the first user, make sure that passive relationship it works, and then if you call followers, oh yeah, this works. So let's keep it that, and then let's do the other side of following relationship. So let's do active relationships. We provide a class name of relationship. Add foreign key of follower ID, and then dependent destroy. All right, and then has been through following through this active relationships. All right, let's test it out in our console. Let's reload that in. We'll fetch the first user and then active relationships. And if you try calling this followings, did I call followings? Yeah. All right, so let's have to reload. User first, user active relationships, user followings, and it erases an error. It says could not find the source. So the reason that this is happening is because we don't have from user's perspective. If you go to relationship model, there's no belongs to following. So you cannot find the source for this has many call. So let's provide the source, which is follower. All right. And just for so that I'll add another source here so that it's going to be symmetric. Followed. Actually, this is the other way around. Follower and followed. All right, let's test it out. Reload. And then let's get the first user. Active relationships. And then if you call followings, oh, I have a typo. Now it's getting the user. If you look at the SQL statement that it generates, it says select user all from user inner join, and then it's using that followed ID as the foreign key. Cool. So now we want to implement a method on this user model. It's going to look, the API is going to look like follow, take in some other user, and then another one for unfollow, take in other user. So let's write our model spec first. So let's go to spec model user.spec.rb rspec describe user. And I usually add another describe block for describing what feature are we testing in this spec. So following and unfollowing other users. It adds relationships between the two users. All right. So before we do that, we need to create some users. So let's write before each do, and then I'll create Luke. Now I'm using factory girl here. So create user, username, Luke Sky Walker. Let solo create user, username Han Solo. All right, so now let's call follow on Luke, passing in solo, and expect Luke to be following solo, to be truthy. So we need three methods, one for follow and following predicate method, and we're gonna do another unfollow solo, and then expect Luke following solo to be falsy. All right, let's save that and then go back to terminal, spec models, user spec, run that. All right, I had some, that was my bad, this is a mistake. So let's make this an instance variable. Or we can actually take out this before block and then just clean up the indentation. Let's try this again. All right, so now it's complaining that we don't have following predicate method, so let's define that in our user.rb following other user. Let's run it again. Oops. Our spec, and then all right. So now we're getting something. So that's cool. All right. So for follow, you can say, because we have this active relationships, we can say active relationships create followed ID, and then passing that other user's ID. And for the unfollow, you basically destroy that relationship. So find by followed ID, and then you will destroy that. So for this one, you can do following IDs, include, and other user ID. Let's run the file spec again. All right, it's passing. Let's test it out in our terminal, in our console. So let's run relc. Let's create, let's just make sure we have enough user. So let's user one, or let's call him current user, user.first. And then let's get the second user, user.second. All right, so we can say current user follow user2, and it creates this record in our database. So now if you ask current user following question mark and then passing user2, it returns true. So let's do the unfollowing, unfollow, and passing user2. It generates this delete SQL. So if you ask current user following user2, it returns false. All right, I think this is a good time to commit. So let's check git diff, and looks good. Before we commit, I want to add a little bit of validation on these fields. So let's do validates followed follower ID presence true, validates followed ID presence true. All right, so let's go back to the spec, and then I'm gonna add a few more expectations. So from Solo's perspective, followers to include Luke, and the opposite, Solo followers not to include Luke. All right, let's run this spec. Alright, it's still passing. Let's make sure that we're not getting false positive by just deleting that line. Alright, let's run that. Alright, so we get an error. So that's seems to be working. Let's run this one more time to make sure it's working before we commit. So let's git add and add association between ships and user model. All right. So we've figured out the low-level stuff, the model layer of the function feature. So now if you run the feature spec, it's still failing because we haven't implemented the UI and the controller for this feature. So let's do that in our next video.